Hi, it's Todd from Todd's Workshop and Todd Cutler here. The Chalke Valley History Festival asked the Arrows vs Armour gang to get back together again and to give a presentation about what we've done. So we did exactly that a couple of weeks ago, and it was good fun. Now obviously not everybody there knew about the series of films that we'd done, so we put together a short film explaining everything, and then a question and answer session. Let it roll. Well, thank you very much for coming. Obviously you have an interest in history and you may have caught some of our films on YouTube. And so first of all, if you haven't caught them, go watch them, they're brilliant. Bit biased, obviously. But I'm Todd Todeschini, I make medieval weapons. Toby Capwell, historian, author, jouster. Will Sherman Fletcher, Joe Gibbs, Bowyer Archer. Mike Chernett, editor, director. We wanted to know what happened when arrows hit armour. So not myth, not legend, not speculation, but as far as we could tell, what actually happened. So we made some films about it. And what we're going to show you now is a short film about making those films. And then we're here for a question and answer session after that. So in the meantime, roll the film. We all know that the longbow was devastating, but when it comes to armoured knights, we don't really know how it was so effective. How did knights get shot by longbows? Such a simple question. So it seems like it should have a simple answer. But what we think we know is often obscured by the power of some of the founding myths of England and of Hollywood, leaving us like two guys in a pub, talking archery, both swearing we're right, and no way of knowing if we are. Mike, friend, director, editor, and I were two of those guys, talking, reading, watching, speculating, but not actually doing. And after watching another clearly misleading YouTube film, we decided to find out for ourselves what happens if you shoot arrows at armour. It is a simple concept, but one that is especially hard for TV companies. Not because they're inveterate liars, but because the format does not support presenting the whole truth, and the whole truth is required for a balanced opinion. TV companies need to have a progressing story, a dramatic finale, and a nicely tied up conclusion, with little time for nuance, deviation, or a lack of pace or results. Experimental archaeology doesn't work like that. The results are the results, like it or not. Exactly because we are not a TV company, we have the luxury of being allowed to get it right. We can work without scripts. The arrow neither has to bounce off nor go through. We can simply observe and report. But to work in this spontaneous way and to provide the historically correct equipment and opinions, we needed real experts who truly understand it and can put everything in context. It all starts with Joe shooting our original breastplate, and although the distance is close and the bow weight is a massive 160 pounds, the arrows were clearly not going through or even getting close to it. But this early shooting made it clear. The male was vulnerable. Arrows getting shot back is not going to happen, and the shapes and the details of the armour are critical to its function. It also became immediately apparent that the jupon, the padded overgarment worn mostly by French knights, changed the way the arrows broke, almost eliminating the debris and creating in modern terms an anti-spalling effect. We had to wait 3 years to discover why this might be of particular importance to well-armoured French knights. We followed this first film with 4 short films discussing the armour, the arrows, the campaign and a Todd and Toby question session. And then we were finished. The first film was enlightening and the response was fantastic, but ultimately it was very limited in scope, looking at arrows striking the front of the breastplate. This singular nature was forced on us by self-funding and very short timescales, but it gave us ambition and a thirst to expand the project. And then COVID hit. By the time we emerged, 3 things were very clear. We wanted all the upper garments of a knight, both hard and soft. We needed preliminary foundation work on specific areas so we'd understand everything about the project better. And thirdly, this was going to cost a lot. So we organised a crowdfunding campaign. We exceeded all our goals and we had enough funding to make 7 films. And suddenly, a nice idea became a massive job. The deeper dive foundation films all looked at specific aspects. Not very exciting films on their own, but invaluable to our understanding. Modern handmade mail is a crazy amount of work, and the price reflects that. So we could only afford it for the Ventail and the Standard, but not the shirt. So how does commercially made mail compare to the best authentic handmade mail today? Armour of the period could have been made of a few different materials, but we had to use a modern material, so we chose mild steel. How close in performance is this to normal irons or steels of the medieval period? Arrowheads could be made from different materials and heat treated in many ways, but how much of a difference does this make? Joe is shooting a 160-pound longbow. Was this typical? And what would happen if he shot a far more reasonable 120 pounds? Armed with all our new and very niche information, we set out on the main film, Arrows vs Armour 2. And where the first film was singular, we tried to be broad as possible, dressing our mannequin in an arming coat, mail, breastplate, arms, standard, ventail and helm. And then we shot him. Oh. Great shooting, Joe. We shot him from the front, the sides, in the neck, the arms, the armpits, the stomach and the head. We shot him lots. Essentially the results were binary. Hit the plate and the armour system would resist it. Hit the mail, with the exception of the aventail, and it would go through. Perhaps you all knew this, but we wanted to observe and to understand. And there was still plenty to see and to learn about the shapes and the thicknesses and the layers. But what amazed me were 2 things. The clear importance of the shapes of the armour and the clouds of small debris generated by the arrow strikes. These clouds of fine flying debris, both of metal and of wood, would be extremely irritating in eyes or throats, and with armoured men having no way to clear them, potentially very dangerous. And I suspect that this is the reason for the popularity of jupons, the padded overgarments, amongst the French. Our group had to disband, but we still had questions without answers, and I was able to carry on. So we made another film before we all split up. You may have noticed a modern crossbow in these films, and it may look out of place, but it shoots Joe's arrows at the same speed that his longbow does. So it is in fact a fantastic facsimile. But we wanted to make sure that this was the case, so we tested it alongside Joe. Knowing the crossbow shoots the same as Joe allowed me to use it in our blunt force trauma film. This is a supposed action created by arrow strikes which causes death or injury even though the armour is not breached. And finally, and it had to come, I shot every arrow I had left at the neck and the head until everything was broken. But I finally managed to get an arrow to go through the helmet, but perhaps not quite in the way that either you or I would expect. After a total of 17 films, we would love to say, I know how it all happened. Well, of course we can't, and that was never going to be the case. The nature of fighting itself, armour, human interactions, chance, and countless other factors means nothing that happened then could be repeatable now. So it would be very hard to extract results from this project, just generalisations. But this all helps to fill in the picture of what happened, and just as importantly, what did not. Conclusive? No. Really useful? We hope so. Thank you. Well, thank you. Oh, blimey. Well, thank you, and on behalf of all of us, thank you. So, really, the floor is open for questions. So, whatever it is that you want to know, whether it's about the filming project itself and how we arranged it and how we edited it and whatever, Mike's here. If it's about the technical details, the campaign, any other thing that you want to know, just ask away. So, open floor.
Thank you very much. A very enlightening film there. My understanding of arrows against medieval armour is that very, very few, as we've seen there, were able to penetrate the armour. But from the knight's point of view, being pummeled by an arrow, a storm of arrows, each one, it's like being hit in the chest with a sledgehammer, repeatedly, bang, 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 bang. Knocks them off their horses, and then they can be dealt with once they're on the ground. How accurate is this understanding for you?
I would actually say not accurate at all, I'm afraid to say. So one of those films we did towards the end there was looking at exactly that. And that was one of the films that I did with the crossbow when Joe had gone. But very simply, if you go onto YouTube, you can find pictures of people wearing ceramic plate body armour and getting shot at point-blank range with assault rifles to demonstrate the armour. There's a fabulous one where the guy is standing on one leg and he sways back slightly. Now that is about 20 to 25 times the energy and significantly more momentum than you get out of an arrow strike. And the guy can stand on one leg whilst he's hit. So the concept of a sledgehammer, the momentum of a sledgehammer is, it's a lovely analogy, but it is vastly, vastly different to the weight of an arrow. You know, you're talking 7.5 kilos versus 75, 80 grams. So I'm afraid to say no, that just isn't the case. What there is of course the body's physical reaction to getting shot. And so you might get very alarmed by getting an arrow in your chest, which is understandable. And so that might make you flinch. That might make you fall off your horse or fall down. But it's not the energy that is contained in the thing. So if the energy is stopped on your breastplate, you are not flying backwards through a barn door. Toby, do you want to add?
Yeah, I would add to that even you are still, as a man in armor, aware of every time you're hit. There's enough of a physical experience to know exactly when you've been hit and where. And a knight is perfectly aware of the protective qualities of his armor, but also of its weaknesses. And he'll be aware that every time he got hit and he was okay, it might not have been okay. And you have this sense of continually dodging, a fatal strike. And so as you're advancing through the field, you have a psychological battle to fight. That the guy in the front rank who's advancing 300 yards to the English line is going to get hit 50 or 60 or 70 times at least. And every time could be the one where you get hit by the lucky arrow. So you have to think of this psychologically as well as physically.
So how much did you actually consider the fact that it might be the horses that got shot, the knight fell off, and then an Englishman came up and stuck a knife through his visor?
Out of the scope of our films, really, I think it's fair to say.
And essentially irrelevant for the main phase of the Battle of Agincourt, which was what we were interested in. There were some initial cavalry actions at Agincourt, but they're really insignificant to the main progress of that battle. The main French advance was on foot in massed ranks of men-at-arms. So the horses can be an issue, but even in this period, horses have very good protection as well. So they're not necessarily as vulnerable. And it's hard to kill a horse. There's a horse that survived the Battle of Little Bighorn, and he got shot with rifle shot like 13 times, and he survived and lived. It's not a simple business to kill the horse with an arrow.
I can also add to that on a practical level, filming how you devise a test with horses to test any kind of theory that you have about that is also a little bit difficult. So it was one of the reasons we chose Agincourt, is that we know a lot about the battle, and also we can, the significant part of it, as Toby says, is men-at-arms facing armour, and that's something that we could test and could find out good information about.
Yeah, since I lived next door to St Breville's Castle for quite a few years, how important is it as a arrowhead manufacturing plant, and what other places are there in the country? Yes, how important is St Breville's castle?
Crucial, yeah. I mean, the good thing about St Breville's is we've got written documentation from that time of what they were making and how many they were making. And in 1228, John Malamort was given the instruction to make 100 arrows or quarrels every single day. And that's complete arrows and arrowheads as a finished item. So 100 a day with a team of, we think, up to about 50. So they were making a huge number. And that's the 1220s, not 1400s, which is an even bigger sort of assemblage of archery equipment.
I think my question would be that just comparing one arrow versus a certain harness which a man should wear it's flawed, because there's so much you can compare, and because of obviously the budget, then just comparing it to one harness is, I think, flawed rather than comparing it to multiple. Yeah,
The point is, you're quite right. The reality, the human reality of fighting on the battlefield is a physically very, very complex situation. And you can't test it in its full complexity. You can't understand it in the full complexity. What we were trying to do is break it down into its fundamental parts and like test one issue at a time and then build it back up to hopefully something that can be applicable to the historical understanding.
But I think you're completely right, and it's a very good question, because on one level, you're saying that everything we've done is meaningless. It's all right. And you're right. On another level, and we were very careful to say, like at the end of that film there, we now don't know everything. We absolutely don't. But if you take this helmet here as an example, if that arrow strikes now here, it's striking more or less at 90 degrees to all surfaces. Now, Joe is a good shot. We have established that. But if we ask for that and not that, where it's now striking at 10 degrees to the surface, the result will be very different. But there's no plausible way on the planet that Joe, or even a bit of test apparatus, can repeat that shot again and again. So unless you can give those answers exactly for everything and look at the planes on that helmet, 20,000 shots of that helmet to understand it, it's just, for us, it's just not possible. If it's a bit of military kit developed by the government, yes, but it's not. So this is as close as we can get, is just to develop some sort of better understanding. Definitely not complete.
And with any test like this, you have to be very, very clear with yourself, as well as everybody else, what the test shows and what it doesn't show. There have been a number of experimental tests using armor and medieval weaponry and things in the past 40 or more years. And the tests themselves have been perfectly fine in some cases, but then the conclusions that are drawn from the results are, wildly optimistic. So we have to do the tests, but be cautious about the conclusions that we draw. This is general information that helps color a very, mysterious issue. I think we know more, but we have to be clear about what we know and what we don't know.
What's nice about what we've done is we've opened up the floor to other people testing. So they can go, well, your test was very wide and general. Let's now focus on something very specific. And we all learn more as a result, don't we?
Yeah.
Rather than us saying this is exactly what happened all the way through the 100 Years' War, we've gone, here's one possibility that may have happened in 1415. Go and do your own research and we'll all learn from you as a result.
I think also what's important to remember is that you've got 5 guys here, and Augusto's not, 6 guys who put this one together. It is ultimately just our opinions. This is what we think the equipment should be and so on. And we can go to the museums and we can go to the written sources and everything else, but ultimately we could have chosen this or we could have chosen that. This is the set of things that we've chosen, but we've been transparent about it, so if you don't like the choices we've made, at least you understand what we've done. But yeah, but good question. Thank you.
Thank you. You said you used the Battle of Agincourt as a kind of a one-off kind of example. When we were watching the film, you were very much straight on to a target. Did you use the accounts of the battle to look at where they were firing from or what angles they were firing from? Is there any more data that you've got from that?
Yes, well, that was actually in the main Arrows versus Armour 2 film. We actually do a number of sessions of shooting with exactly that. We followed the sort of story of the advancing knights, first shooting straight on to our figure, our target, and then we turn him slightly and turn him a little bit more. So we actually got some good data from shooting at the sides, the thinner parts of the breastplate on the side. So it was actually designed to tell that story if we could. And again, one of the things that we wanted to test was the quote about French knights being worried about arrows piercing the breaths and the sights of their helms, which of course is what's going to happen if arrows are coming in from the side. So that was one thing that we did actually want to test, and if you have a look at the helm, we tested it.
Thank you very much for the great work you've done on the experimental archaeology. It's offered, I think, terrific insight into some of the effects. What my question is what was the difference in technology, both in terms of the arrows and the armour, between Crécy and Agincourt? And did that have any material effect on the level of casualties? Because my understanding is at Crécy there were a great many more French casualties than there were at Agincourt. I wondered if the technology had sort of improved on the armour side and provided more protection.
Will, do you want to start with the arrow bit? Because that's probably an easier question.
Yeah, so when we look back in history, we're really stuck with arrows to copy and to use. We've got the Mary Rose from the 1540s, which are our only complete finished arrows, other than Westminster Abbey. There was an arrow in the roof of a chantry there from 1420-something, which is a very different arrow to what we were using. It's a light bearing arrow with a very small head. The actual head that I made for the films, was a Crécy head. So one was found on the battlefield of Crécy, and that's the head that we used to copy, because that fits on the arrow that we're shooting out of Joe's bow that works really well. Everything came together in like a holy grail of weights and performance and that kind of thing. But I think in general, when you look at the armour, and Toby can tell you more about the armour of that time, they reached a point where the technology was coming together and it plateaus for a bit. You can't do more with a piece of wood, you can't do more with a piece of iron, and the armour is what's determining the weapon against it, really.
Yeah, Crécy and Agincourt are often generalized and assumed to almost be replays of the same battle. You often hear Crécy and Agincourt both referenced in the same sentences and both treated as though they were similar battles, but actually they were fantastically different in all kinds of ways. And even before you get to the state of armor technology, 60 or 70 years earlier, you have to remember that the proportion of archers and men-at-arms, knights, or men fighting in the manner of knights, the makeup of the English army was very different. At Crécy, it was about half and half. Half of the army was archers, half of it was knights and men-at-arms. Whereas at Agincourt, it was something like 1/5 men-at-arms and 4/5 archers. And over that period of the 100 Years' War, the English had learned that different makeups were more effective for a diversity of reasons. So in the later 14th century, Richard II's armies are 2/3 archers, 1/3 men-at-arms. Then it goes 3/4, then it goes 4/5 under Henry V. So they're learning that there's a small group of knights that can still work very effectively if there's less of them, but you get a lot of benefit, different kinds of benefits out of having more archers. They're cheaper for one thing, so you get more men for the same money. But good archers are also good light infantrymen, and they can fight at close quarters and support the knights in the press of the battle after all of the shooting's been done. So we have to first think of Crécy and Agincourt as different battles. And then, of course, the armor is at a very different level of its evolution. Armor evolves very rapidly, decade by decade. There's new designs, new materials, and new ideas about how to combine different protective materials that have different functions. So essentially at Crécy, the armor was less good against arrows. They hadn't had that 60 or 70 years to improve the armor's capacity to resist arrows. But But on the other side, we don't know that much about the bows, and were they shooting the same weight of bows? Was the weapon the same at Cressy? We just don't know. It could be that they started shooting heavier bows later on to keep pace with better quality armor. But on the other hand, they might have had exactly the same bows. I think it's quite hard to say, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly how the draw weights went up through the centuries. But we definitely chose this weight of bow, the 160 pounds, because, as Will mentioned earlier, with the 80 grams of arrow, you need a fairly good bow to get that moving at a good speed to deliver some amount of energy onto the armour at the other end.
I mean, Joe, what your gut feeling? Let's just say you pick a year like 1300. Do you think the bows were significantly different to 1450, or basically the same?
I'd say basically the same.
Same kind of weight, same kind
I think so, yeah. I don't think it would be a huge difference. The peak may have been slightly less, but the average bow would have been the same.
It's a good point that we're using a Cressy arrowhead, because the size of if you find the arrowhead in the ground, that already tells you quite a lot.
Yeah.
Because the arrowhead has a socket of a certain diameter. That socket of that certain diameter goes on a particular shaft. And if the shaft is this diameter, then the arrow is this weight, 80 grams or whatever, and that tells you what kind of range of bow you have to throw that arrowhead on that arrow at that particular moment.
Yeah, developed at the same time, aren't they? So you wouldn't make a really heavy 80-gram arrow with a very heavy kind of anti-plate head and then try and shoot out of a 110-pound bow. There's just no point. So.
And Cressy was the first time that the English had fielded mass archers. I mean, that many archers. They'd been working on the plan for a while, and they'd used their initial ideas of lots of archers working with men-at-arms against the Scots before they moved across and started really using it seriously against the French. So in that early battle, yet the arrows could have been defeating the armor a lot more. And also, Cressy was a battle where they fought primarily on horseback. The French charged the English line 13 times at the Battle of Cressy. So that suggests they didn't understand, that this wasn't working, and that there was a new dynamic, and they needed to go away and improve their armor.
Could you test, horse armor in Arrows versus Armour 3?
That's a great idea. Why didn't we think of that?
Can I just add a living knight on top of that horse, please?
Well, we've got a bow, we've got some arrows.
No, wait a second here.
Yes, you could. It could be done, but again, it would be massively expensive to do. And essentially, I think if we were to do it, it would, in a way, repeat the same kind of format that we did in Arrows versus Armour 2. I think it would be that kind of a format. But then, of course, you probably got 5 times the cost of armour, or maybe more, I don't know. And I don't know how much a horse mannequin would cost.
I think as well, we can generalise a little bit from the tests that we have done, because we know where the arrows struck, and we know whether, for example, on a thinner part of armour, we know that it will go through here. And if the horse armour is made in a similar sort of thickness and a similar sort of material, we can make that assumption that you would defeat horse armour with this bow, with this arrow, at that distance. So there are things we can already say from our testing that we've done already. I would put out maybe a question for you guys, that we can't promise an Arrows versus Armour 3, but maybe a question would be, if there was, is there something that you would want to see? Where would you go with it?
I remember that discussion we had over your wife's fantastic bolognese about Arrows versus Armour 3 on the first night, and we all agreed it has to be a very different time period. We haven't tested everything from 1415 alone, but we've kind of done big arrows into thick and thin armour of different shapes.
Yeah,
there's a massive scope of arrows being used in warfare, going way back into the Viking period, that would be a very different result.
Yeah, I think on the Arrows vs Armour 3 point is that this project was massive, and it did basically use us up, I think it's fair to say. And it would be nice to do something simpler, but as Will says, there is a very interesting story about effectively the Arrow Armour arms race. And if we pick a random date, let's say 1066, and you go forward from there, but you look at the armour that was available at the time, and again, you can't do a full armoured figure, but you could do a sample of that armour. So you look at the armour that was available in 1066 and the arrows that are available, and then you jump forward 100 years and you do the same again. And so you're effectively telling the story of arrow development and armour development as we go along, but that would need to be done in sample pieces rather than whole actual armour pieces. But that strikes me as a slightly easier and very interesting film, so that might be a contender if there is a third.
Hey, Joe, what is your top of your list of things to shoot at next?
You? No. That's a hard question, actually. Be quite interesting to do a moving target, but that'd be hard to set up, wouldn't it?
Right.
Anything we can think of, really. I'm happy to shoot at anything, moving or still.
Simple man.
Yeah.
How different would it be smacking someone with like a mace compared to the bows you use shooting them with arrows, people, whatever?
In terms of the damage to the armour?
Yes.
The momentum would be a lot more on a mace, but I think ultimately they're a little bit less spiky if you're thinking of something like a horseman's hammer or the bec de Corbin or something. Or are you thinking of the energy?
More of like the damage done, really. So the energy. How much would the energy?
So again, that becomes a hammer blow, and something like a mace effectively isn't going to penetrate the armour. So that's more of a question for Toby in the sense of what would it feel like to get hit by, let's say, a 1.5 pound hammer in the middle of the chest? Not good, but
or perhaps a lance
or head. Well, a lance is very different. But.
Certainly the energy imparted by a lance, with a lance rest involved, the amount of energy involved is much higher than an arrow strike. The lance is the most powerful weapon by far in the late Middle Ages, with the exception of firearms. There are different kinds of weapons that are doing different things. I mean, from my point of view as a fighter, getting hit, with a poleaxe square on the helmet is a lot more unpleasant than getting hit with an arrow, as long as the arrow doesn't go through, obviously. But the concussive effect is much more disconcerting. There's really very little, next to no concussion or, that sense of being, strongly struck by an arrow. It's a very quick, sharp crack rather than a heavy crunch, if you see what I mean.
Thank you. Question for Toby. At the Battle of Agincourt, to what extent did the English go into the battle thinking they had a technical advantage with the arrows and the archery? And how did that, if that was the case, how did that impact how the battle unfolded?
That's a great question, and now we get into what really matters in the thinking about a battle like Agincourt. It's so often the first thing out of military historians' mouths is, will the arrow go through the armor? And that's really not, cosmically the most important question. The makeup of the armies was very different, and their psychological state was very different. As far as the English had fantastically good morale and a very, very strong, clear chain of command. Every person in Henry V's army knew exactly what he was there for and who he was in charge of and who he answered to. Very, very clear, very well motivated. And, you can understand that because Henry V executed people for just about anything. I mean, you look at his ordinances, and the penalty for just about any misstep is death. So that's one reason there was good order. And they had force diversity. They had archers and men-at-arms in a very, very clear package, working as, what we often hear in the news as combined arms. The archers and the men-at-arms knew each other. They had been recruited from the same parts of the world. Each knight had come with his archers from his area, and they'd been recruited together, and they knew each other. and they fought together. And the whole military structure was designed to enforce this kind of good morale and good order. And they could compensate for each other's strengths and weaknesses. The archers have strengths, but they also have weaknesses. They don't have as much armor. They haven't been trained to fight since they were 3. But the knights have their strengths and weaknesses, and it worked very well together. The French did have archers, but they didn't use them. The archers stayed at the back and weren't deployed. And, it's no good counting troop numbers. You can only really count the troops that engage. That's all that matters. And the French army was entirely men-at-arms. 10,000 men-at-arms advancing on the English line. So they're very good at certain things, but they have no way of compensating for their key weaknesses. And that up against the English was disastrous. And the French were also several armies coming from all over France, and they had several royal princes of the blood who all thought they should be in charge. And the one guy, Marshal Boucicaut, who really should have been in overall command, was having to ask the permission of all these higher-ranking nobles. So they didn't have exactly what the English did have, which was good structure, good command, and good tactics. That's what mattered. And the mud was a problem too, obviously.
Hi. So it sounds like at best being hit by arrows is going to be quite distracting, and you need obviously 100% faith in your armor as you're charging down these masked archers. Is there evidence that they would have regularly trained to get used to the experience of it?
Sometimes it depends on the individual. The aristocracy, or the knightly class, is actually a very diverse group of people who each have their own idea of what knighthood means and what their duties and responsibilities and personal aptitudes are about. So there's some knights who were essentially professional warriors, and that's all they did and all they cared about. And there are others that were largely political administrators who didn't fight very often and didn't keep themselves in as good a physical condition. It's a very diverse group of people. So in the French army, you will have had some hardcore, serious military people, but you would have had a lot of people that hadn't worn their armor in a year, and most of them had never fought a major battle against the English.
The accepted wisdom is that at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, the English archer was the difference. I think you said that the percentage of archers in the English army had increased through the 100 Years' War. Which implies that they were seen as incredibly effective. You have shown that they can't go through plate. But does that mean volume? Volume of arrows will find a weakness. And maybe the next experiment is to see the odds of you not taking a fatal arrow with volume of arrows. Because otherwise we're saying that the archers weren't effective. And the accepted wisdom is, and what you said about the numbers increasing, suggests that the English were absolutely sure they were.
Well, when you say that they weren't effective, so...
Todd, can I just cut out? I got to run. So we know that they were effective. There's no question of that. Nobody's saying the bow isn't a good weapon. It's about understanding how that effectiveness really worked, and that it's not just about going through the heaviest parts of the armor. But I have to go get on a horse now. So after you finish with these handsome people, come to the tilt yard and see what's happening next. But I gotta go if I can get out of this chair.
I'll get the crane out.
All right, Toby. Thank you. Catch you around.
Thank you, Toby. Good luck.
Yeah.
Good luck. That's a man who's just seen the clock. Yes, just to finish off on that, I think it was around 1 in 5 arrow strikes which hit the male. Now, those seem to be damaging to one level or another, depending where they struck. But so 1 in 5 arrows actually making a difference is quite a big deal. But then also don't forget that the armour that we put him in, some armour's better made than others, some material's better made than others, there's flaws that you can't see, there are the lucky shots. Now, looking at this helmet here, there's a strike here which went clean through the edge of the visor, but it then landed 6 millimeters in from the edge of the helmet. Now, had that strike been 6 millimeters further across, that would have been straight through his temple or his eye sockets. So in our tests, yes, we didn't get an arrow through the plate armour, or not the significant stuff. We did through the arms, but it's not to say that it never happened, but I think it is fair to say that it would very rarely happen.
Yeah, I make the point as well that you don't have to kill a knight with every single shot for the weapon to still be effective. Archers at all sorts of battles, they make the enemy deploy in a particular way. They make them funnel them towards the English men-at-arms, perhaps. And again, I think probably the answer is yes, that volume of arrows is probably more important than the individual strength of an individual shot, because there is always going to be a weak point. We were discussing on the way up here today, but often men-at-arms choose to wear less armour to be more mobile, and there is always going to be a weak spot. You can't protect every single part of you with plate, so every suit of armour is going to have a vulnerability. The lady asked earlier about archers getting to the side and even maybe the back to be able to shoot at the back of knights. In 1415 at Agincourt, a lot of knights didn't actually even have a back plate. They may have had only a breastplate. That means that half of their body is only protected by mail. And we showed that even with a lesser weight bow than 180 pounds, even with maybe a 120-pound bow, or possibly even less than that, you can compromise different types of mail. And mail is not even one thing either.
But also, I mean, it's a question over for Joe, but I've seen him walk out, string a bow, and shoot an arrow 130 yards that day.
230.
Oh, no, the where you put it through the king's helmet.
Oh, yes, 140 yards.
140 yards. So I'm not saying every shot's like that.
No.
But if you do see people who are not wearing the leg armour or badly worn, 100-yard shot is quite plausible.
Yeah, you can hit a man at 100 yards.
You can.
Quite happily, yeah. a good, I'd say a good trained, from childhood. So he's had a good 7 or 8 years of doing archery. He should be able to string up a bow and hit a man at 100 yards within sort of 2 or 3 arrows, I'd say. Definitely.
And there's 7,000 of them.
Yeah.
At any one time. That's the point, isn't it? That's why you use so many of them at one time, is if the one person misses his one mark, he's going to hit the guy next to him 7,000 times over at any one time.
All right. Yeah.
Hi, I'm really impressed, Joe, with how you can sort of pull a 160 plus 200-pound bow. Just wondering whether it makes a difference in terms of your position, because my understanding is that they would fire they would shoot basically the oncoming knights from quite a distance. So you're shooting the arrows maybe 30, 40 degrees, rather than doing what you were doing in your test where you're shooting them from 20 yards. Does that have an impact on your body, trying to pull the bow back at that kind of angle? And also another sort of technical implication of that is, obviously, if you're shooting long distance, the arrow has lost a lot of its energy by the time it's kind of coming down on the archers. Have you done any tests in terms of the energy of the arrow on impact from 20 yards versus, say, 200 yards? I'm interested in your thoughts.
For the angle on your body, not really, because I can shoot all the way down there to all the way up there. There's no problem, because your upper body is always fixed, so you're just moving at the hips all the time. So once you've drawn up, you're locked in. You can't move here. You have to move like this, so you can go up or down. It's not an issue at all for that one. And for your second question, we didn't do any.
We did, yeah.
Not super long. We went out to 70 metres. I
think we went to 70 metres. So we did consider this, and obviously a lot of the testing was at close range for practical reasons that we want Joe to be able to hit the target as many times as possible. But yeah, we tested with a high-speed camera where we could see the trajectory of the arrow and we could get an accurate speed of the arrow. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head what it lost after
No,
after 70 metres.
I'm going to say it lost about 15% of its velocity after 70 metres. It was around that number. Now, with that, you get a disproportionately higher loss in energy. But equally, in some of our tests, we also showed that a 120-pound bow shooting an arrow much slower was still going through mail and so on. So it is still, regardless, a very effective weapon out at that distance. So 200 yards, absolutely, it'd be an effective weapon. However, there is not that much evidence that long-distance engagement like that was the norm. It does seem, and it might be stylistic, but it does seem, if you look at manuscript pictures, and arrow shooting tends to be pretty close. And when you also talk about elevation, again, I remember that day when I was watching you shoot 140 yards.
Yeah.
The elevation must have been
not
maybe
much.
about that.
Yeah, not much.
So 20 degrees. It's definitely not the 40, 45 degrees that is always in Hollywood. It's just not that.
One thing that I find quite interesting is the Westminster Abbey arrow, because that's from 1420, around that time. So we're talking Agincourt period, and it's completely different to what we've been using for our tests. It's not designed clearly for going through plate or an attempt to go through plate.
But it's also very short, isn't it?
It's 28.5 inches, which is roughly in there anyway.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is in that Mary Rose
it's
length
in that,
range. But it's a Type 16 head and a very light one, but the arrow's barrelled, so it's wider in the middle than it is at both ends. I mean, Joe can chime in, but that's a distance arrow, so it's a flight arrow, really.
So with the ones we were shooting, so the 80 grams, so, 250, 260 yards or something like this. But with the Westminster, the one that Will was just talking about, I think it's probably more of a distance arrow, sort of harassing arrow, because with that, you can do 300 plus yards. That's a long way for an arrow, especially out of a heavy longbow.
And it won't go through something at the other end, but it will make the other army decide on a move. They
through
can't
you,
just stand there. They might either come towards you or leave. So that's an arrow that defines what happens in combat. And so they're making arrows for a reason. And if you shoot those arrows to begin with and bring an army onto you, because they have to move, you can then hit them with ease. So they may well have been using different arrows for different distances. And
yeah. I mean, I might be wrong, but I believe that there was some long-distance shooting at the beginning of Agincourt, which is basically just to annoy the French and make them do something.
There's written evidence, isn't there, of bearing arrows, which is what we're talking about there.
I think as well, also, just a point to make, is we only ever claim that we can make some generalisations from everything that we've done. And one of the generalisations we can make is that we know that Joe, at what is basically point-blank range with the heaviest plausible bow that's been using, is not piercing the plate at that distance. So we can say, I think we've found fairly conclusively, that at the longer range and with a potentially lighter arrow, we are not going to be piercing any of the plate, really. That we haven't conclusively said whether it's going to pierce all the different types of mail that might have been on the battlefield, or someone in lesser armour, or a lucky shot is still possible at that long distance. So those are unknowns, but we can certainly say something from our tests. And if it didn't go through, it's kind of the justification for using the heavy bow at the close distance, is that we can then disclude, we can then say that anything lighter than that and at the longer distance would definitely not go through.
Gentlemen, thank you. This is high-grade, high-quality armour that the knights were using, but they had a lot of men-at-arms. How were they armoured, and was it any proof against longbows?
Actually, I would discount the fact to say this was particularly high-grade armour. We chose to do this one in mild steel. The first time round we did a carbon steel, which we probably erroneously thought was a lower grade than it actually was. So this one now we've gone for mild steel, which seems to be, from our testing, a good analogue for sort of charcoal iron and a low-grade steel of the time. So the material it's made from is not particularly exotic. Not particularly expensive. So, yeah, just sort of a regular kind of knight's armour, I think, is probably where we'd pitch it. I think Toby's the guy you really want to ask for men-at-arms and how different they'd be attired. But my understanding is that a man-at-arms could be wearing basically the same stuff as a knight, but just not knighted. I think that's...
You can also, again, you can generalise that we're... Joe was putting arrows through most of the types of mail that we tested, and so if a man is wearing a gambeson and mail, then you can say that it would go through that. As to how much coverage he has, I think that would be very variable. It's hard to say, hard to make any real generalizations about that.
Hello. In terms of a dream thing for a theoretical arrows versus Armour 3, would it be perhaps interesting, you've mentioned the different materials and thicknesses, would it be perhaps interesting to go, well, this is the thinnest, worst quality material of armour that we can point to in historical evidence, and have maybe 3 or 4 sets of maybe breastplates that graduate through to the best Milanese white harness, and then go back through that comparison, altering the arrowheads, from this is the cheapest, quickest knocked out iron, all the way up to here's a solid steel head that we've coated in beeswax or something like that, and see what the relative penetration values are at that point.
I think the problem with that is, from my point of view, and I don't know how the others stand, is that sort of PhD thesis territory, which is something that I actually aren't really interested in doing. But the other thing is, one of the things that I do like about this is that you can take something that perhaps people know or think they know, and you can look at it and you can put it together in an entertaining way that will then get perhaps not all of the knowledge, but some knowledge out there to a wider group of people that otherwise would never have picked it up and would never have watched it. Watching arrows shatter on a breastplate, actually lots of people are interested in that, but they're not necessarily interested in the finer points of armour construction. And so by packaging a film together in a way that is entertaining, generally entertaining, gets the information out there, even if you lose some of the possible information en route. So I do understand what you're getting at, that you could do a full analysis of looking at that. But actually, I just want to go and do something else instead. I want to go and play with the trebuchet or something, So there is a limit to how deep.
We'd also need some more very generous sponsors to do the whole range of harnesses.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the point, isn't it? We've opened up the door, like I said earlier, to people going into really specific detail.
Yeah.
And if they've got access to a particular type of armour and arrowhead, they can now go and test it with the rest of it as a background and justify why they're doing it.
And also, indeed, materials, because the materials that you require to do it are unbelievably specialist and hard to source. To give you an idea, those 3 samples of material we had, which are 20 centimetres square, for the plate test we did, were £1,000, for 3 bits of sheet material.
I think we'll do one more question and then draw it to close.
Lovely.
Hi. Obviously, you've dedicated quite a lot of time and effort into promoting accuracy in representations of archery. So when you see things like that scene in the Hunger Games where Katniss shoots an arrow past a group of people into an apple in a hog roast, does that make you want to cry a little bit?
You could do that.
Or is it all in good fun?
Any film you watch, anything, if you get bothered by the detail, it's gone. Enjoy the film for what it is in its entirety.
Let's just say, don't watch any Hollywood films with anyone here on the stage. You won't have a good time.
Yeah, we 3 of us sat down. Matt Easton, who does another YouTube channel, and an Australian stunt guy, New Zealand stunt guy actually, and myself. We sat down. We watched a film called The 13th Warrior, which is I love it. But you've got gladiators' helmets and Spanish morions in the Viking world. So gives you an idea. But we tried to do a film where the 3 of us reacted to it, and we'd stop the camera and stop the film and have a conversation. Anyway, and I think we're about an hour and a half in of filming and about 2 minutes into the film. So,
the one point on that though. After Arrows vs. Armour 1 came out, one of the things that I liked the most about that is the sound that the arrows make when they were hitting the breastplates. And I remember watching Netflix's The King, and they had a scene in there where there were a lot of arrows coming in and hitting armour, and it sounded just like the arrows sounds that we were making when Joe was shooting the breastplate and the armour. And if we've influenced anything like that, then I would be happy.
Well, actually, I'll just round this up with one thing then, and I'll say my bit. Is there one thing from the films we've done that we could introduce into popular culture, Hollywood culture? And for me, it would be a slow motion shot at the beginning of some sort of knights advancing film with the arrows just turning to dust on the breastplates. But, Will?
What an arrow looks like. When you look at any kind of modern culture film or artwork, the arrows don't look like arrows. They're made as a kind of a mismatch of all kinds of different things. What we've done here is we've shown people how big they are, what they really look like, the colours involved, the glue colours, that kind of thing, and what the heads are meant to look like. And I've seen already these things being used properly and drawn properly and filmed properly, which is quite nice for me.
Joe?
The technique of the archer, so in a lot of things you see very upright, drawing to here. If you look at sort of tribes all around the world, most of them are right back here, get the bow weight on your back, a lot of power. That's would be for me.
Mike?
Well, like I said, it's
Sound.
the sound and the vision of it, what it really is like with the arrows coming in and exploding and the bits flying everywhere and the sound of it. If we can see that in a Hollywood movie, I'll be a happy man.
Lovely.
And with that, I think it's time to draw it to close. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for the fantastic panel and talk from the Arrows and Armour team. Thank you very much.